I never imagined that one day I would feel like a stranger in the very house where I raised my children. A house built with my sacrifices, my sleepless nights, my prayers whispered into the dark. For decades, I believed that love was enough, that if I gave everything I had as a mother, it would one day return to me in the form of respect, care, and security. I was wrong. My name doesn't matter as much as my story does. I am a mother, a grandmother, an old woman who once believed her son's home would always be her safest place. I had moved in with my son after my health began to fail. My joints ached constantly, my hands trembled when I held a cup of tea, and climbing stairs felt like climbing a mountain. My son insisted I come live with him. He said it was the least he could do after all I had done for him. I believed him. At first, things seemed fine. I tried not to be a burden. I woke up early, helped where I could, stayed quiet when conversations didn't include me. I told myself this was what aging looked like, becoming invisible, slowly fading into the background. Still I smiled. Still, I thanked God for a roof over my head and family around me. But small things began to change. Meals were eaten without me unless I reminded them I hadn't eaten. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Decisions were made about the house, about my space, about my belongings, without asking me. My presence became inconvenient. I could feel it in the sighs, in the sharp tones, in the way my name was called only when something needed to be done. My son avoided my eyes more often. When I tried to talk to him, truly talk, he brushed me off. Not now, Mom. Later. You worry too much. His words were gentle, but his distance was loud. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, this was my child. The boy I carried for 9 months. The one I protected from the world. Surely, he wouldn't let anything happen to me. Then came the day that changed everything. It wasn't a dramatic argument at first. No shouting. No broken objects. Just words. Cold, sharp words that cut deeper than any scream. I was told I complained too much. That I was negative. That my presence made the house uncomfortable. And in that moment, standing there with my hands clenched tightly in front of me, I realized something terrifying. I was no longer welcome. That night, I lay awake in the small room they had given me, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of a house that no longer felt like home. My heart felt heavy, not just with sadness, but with fear. Where does a mother go when her own child's home becomes unsafe? What happens when love turns into obligation? And obligation turns into resentment? I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. At first, I tried to convince myself that nothing was truly wrong. I told myself that every family goes through adjustments, that living together under one roof can be difficult, especially when generations clash. I reminded myself that my son had responsibilities, pressures I could not fully see. So I stayed quiet. I lowered my expectations. I carried my loneliness like a secret I was ashamed to admit even to myself. Each morning, I woke before everyone else, not because I wanted to, but because I felt safest when the house was still asleep. In those early hours, I could move freely without worrying about being in the way. I made myself a simple cup of tea, careful not to make noise. I cleaned small things, not because I was asked to, but because I wanted to feel useful. Uselessness, I was learning, hurts more than physical pain. As the days passed, I noticed how often I apologized. I apologized for sitting too long in the living room. I apologized for asking questions. I apologized for existing. The words slipped out automatically, as if my presence itself required justification. No one ever told me to apologize, but no one told me I didn't have to either. My health worsened quietly. The pain in my knees became sharper, my back stiffer. Some days, standing up felt like my body was betraying me piece by piece. I mentioned it once, casually, hoping for concern. My son nodded, distracted, and said we would look into it later. Later never came. I stopped mentioning it after that. Pain is easier to bear than disappointment. What hurt most wasn't the physical neglect. It was the emotional distance. The house was full of voices, laughter, plans, yet I felt completely alone. Meals were rushed affairs, eaten in separate rooms. If I didn't come out on time, no one checked on me. Sometimes I wondered what would happen if I didn't come out at all. I thought often about the past. About the nights I stayed awake when my children were sick. The meals I skipped so they could eat. The years I spent putting everyone else first without question. I never expected repayment, but I had believed, foolishly perhaps, that love leaves a trace. That sacrifice creates memory. Instead, it felt like my role had expired. There were moments when I tried to reach out. Small attempts. A gentle comment. A shared memory. But my words often fell into silence or were met with irritation. I learned to read the signs. The tightening of shoulders, the quick glances, the impatience just beneath the surface. I learned when to stop talking mid-sentence. I began spending more time in my room. It became my refuge and my prison. I arranged my belongings neatly, as if order could give me control. I sat by the window for hours, watching people live their lives freely. Mothers holding hands with their children. Elderly couples walking slowly together. Scenes that reminded me of what I had lost without fully understanding when it slipped away. Deep inside, a quiet fear grew. Not of being yelled at. Not of being thrown out. But of disappearing completely. Of becoming so insignificant that my absence would go unnoticed. That fear kept me awake at night. Staring into the darkness. Wondering how a lifetime of love could lead to such emptiness. I didn't know it then. But this slow erosion of dignity was preparing me for something far worse. The silence, the neglect, the emotional distance. They were only the beginning. And soon, the fragile balance I was clinging to would shatter in a way I could never have imagined. The shift from emotional distance to something far more unsettling did not happen all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as routine, until fear became a constant companion. I began to feel watched, measured, as if every movement I made was being judged. The smallest things, how long I stayed in the bathroom, where I placed my shoes, whether I spoke too much or too little, seemed to invite irritation. I learned to shrink myself, to move softly, to exist in ways that would not draw attention. Silence, once a choice, became a survival instinct. I stopped expressing opinions altogether. When asked a question, I answered briefly, carefully. When decisions were discussed, I stayed quiet, even when they affected me directly. I told myself that peace was more important than dignity, that keeping harmony was worth the cost of my voice. But deep inside, something was breaking. Living without being seen, without being heard, begins to feel like living without air. There were moments when tension filled the house so thickly that I could almost touch it. A simple request could turn into a sharp exchange. A misunderstanding could linger for days, unspoken yet heavy. I found myself constantly bracing for reactions, scanning faces, adjusting my behavior to avoid conflict. The home I once believed would protect me had become unpredictable. And unpredictability breeds fear faster than anger ever could. At night, sleep became difficult. My body ached, but my mind refused to rest. I replayed conversations over and over, wondering what I could have said differently, what I could have done to make things easier for everyone. I blamed myself more than anyone else ever could. Years of being a mother had trained me well. To absorb discomfort, to fix problems quietly, to believe that love meant endurance. But endurance, I was learning, has limits. What frightened me most was how normal all of this began to feel. Fear settled into my routine as naturally as breathing. I told myself this was just how things were now, that aging meant losing control, losing space, losing safety. Yet a small voice inside me refused to be silenced completely. It whispered that this wasn't right. That love should not feel like walking on glass. That family should not make you afraid to exist. I began to realize that what I was experiencing was not just neglect. It was erosion. Of confidence. Of identity. Of self-worth. And erosion is dangerous because it happens slowly, until one day you look at yourself and no longer recognize who you are. I had spent my life being strong for others, but now, in the quiet of my own thoughts, I wondered if I had any strength left for myself. Still I stayed. Not because I felt safe, but because I felt trapped, by age, by dependence, by the fear of having nowhere else to go. Each day blurred into the next, carrying the same weight, the same silence. I did not yet know that the fear I was learning to live with was only the beginning, and that soon, the silence would break in a way that would change everything forever. I often think back to the weeks leading up to the moment everything finally collapsed, and what frightens me most is how slowly I accepted the unbearable as normal. By then, my days had become painfully predictable. Waking early to avoid being noticed. Eating little so no one would accuse me of being demanding. Spending hours alone in my room listening to the muffled sounds of life continuing without me. I lived carefully, as if one wrong step might trigger something I could not control. Every word I spoke was measured, every movement restrained. I had reduced myself to a shadow of the woman I once was, convincing myself that survival meant silence. Yet inside me, a quiet storm was building, made of unspoken pain, humiliation, and a longing to be treated like a human being rather than an inconvenience. My body, however, could not keep up with the role I forced it to play. The aches in my knees became unbearable. My hands stiffened so badly some mornings that holding a spoon felt like a struggle. I grew weaker, thinner, more exhausted, but I hid it well. Asking for help felt dangerous. Need, I had learned, was unwelcome. Still, there are limits even the most patient heart cannot endure. One afternoon, after nearly falling while trying to stand up, I realized how fragile my situation truly was. If something happened to me, would anyone even notice in time? That thought stayed with me, heavy and frightening, because deep down I already knew the answer. I decided, quietly and without drama, that I needed to speak. Not to accuse, not to argue, but simply to be honest. I rehearsed the words in my mind again and again, shaping them carefully so they wouldn't sound like complaints. I wanted to explain how lonely I felt, how invisible I had become, how afraid I was living in a place that no longer felt safe. I told myself that once they understood, things might change. After all, this was my family. Surely, they would listen if I spoke from the heart. The moment finally came one evening when the tension in the house felt unbearable. Everyone was present, and the air itself seemed charged with impatience. My heart pounded as I spoke, my voice softer than I intended, but steady. I said I was struggling. I said I felt unwanted. I said I needed respect, not control. For a brief second, there was silence, and in that silence I dared to hope. What followed shattered that hope completely. My words were not received with understanding, but with defensiveness. I was told I was exaggerating, that I was too sensitive, that I should be grateful instead of causing problems. Gratitude, once again, was used to erase my pain. The conversation escalated quickly, my calm met with irritation, my honesty treated as an attack. I tried to explain myself further, but my voice was drowned out by raised tones and accusations I never expected to hear. In that moment, I understood something devastating. They were not interested in how I felt, only in how my feelings inconvenienced them. Fear took hold of me then, sharp and unmistakable. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as emotions spiraled out of control. I remember wanting to leave, to step away and breathe, but even that felt impossible. The tension exploded into chaos so quickly that my body reacted before my mind could catch up. I stumbled, lost my balance, and fell hard. The pain was immediate and blinding, but worse than the pain was the shock. The disbelief that it had come to this. That my attempt to speak had ended with me on the ground, vulnerable and injured, in the place that was supposed to protect me. As I lay there, time seemed to slow. Voices shifted from anger to panic, but the damage was already done. Something inside me broke in that moment, not just physically, but emotionally. The final illusion, that love alone could fix this, disappeared. I saw the truth clearly for the first time. Silence had not kept me safe. Endurance had not earned me respect. And staying quiet had only allowed the situation to grow more dangerous. While help was called and the chaos settled, I felt an overwhelming clarity wash over me. This was no longer something I could handle privately. This was no longer about preserving family harmony at my own expense. Lying there, shaken and hurt, I made a decision that terrified me almost as much as what had just happened. I decided that I would no longer protect behavior that harmed me. No matter how painful the consequences, I would choose my own safety and dignity. That night marked the end of the life I had been quietly tolerating. I didn't yet know what steps I would have to take, or how much my world was about to change, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. There was no going back. The silence was broken, and once broken, it could never be repaired. The days that followed felt unreal, as if I were watching my own life from a distance. My body was injured, but it was my heart that felt truly shattered. I moved slowly, carefully, each step reminding me of how vulnerable I had become. The house felt different now, not just tense, but unsafe in a way I could no longer ignore or excuse. Every sound startled me. Every conversation made my chest tighten. I realized then that fear had settled deep inside me, and staying would only allow it to grow. People around me spoke in hushed voices, offering explanations, apologies that felt incomplete, words meant to smooth things over without addressing the truth. I listened quietly, but something in me had changed. The part of me that once accepted everything in the name of peace was gone. In its place was a fragile but determined resolve. I understood that this was no longer about misunderstanding or hurt feelings. It was about survival. For the first time in my life, I considered leaving my own child's home not as a failure, but as an act of courage. The thought terrified me. Where would I go? How would I manage at my age with my health? These questions haunted me, yet staying frightened me more. I knew that if I remained, I would continue shrinking until there was nothing left of me. As I prepared to take that step, memories flooded my mind. The years of sacrifice. The love I gave freely, without condition. I mourned not only what had happened, but what I had believed family would always be. Letting go of that belief felt like grieving a loss that had no funeral, no public acknowledgement, only quiet pain. The decision to protect myself was not sudden or dramatic. It came slowly, through sleepless nights and silent tears. I weighed every fear against the simple truth that my life still mattered. That my safety mattered. That my dignity mattered. No mother should have to earn the right to feel secure. When I finally made my choice, it felt both devastating and relieving. I knew there would be consequences, strained relationships, judgment, loneliness, but I also knew that staying would cost me far more. Leaving was not about punishment or revenge. It was about reclaiming the right to exist without fear. That chapter of my life was closing, painfully but necessarily. I stepped forward uncertainly, carrying little more than my resolve, and the hope that somewhere, somehow, I could begin again. Leaving that house was one of the hardest things I have ever done, not because I didn't know I was right, but because every step away from it felt like tearing myself apart from the life I had built for decades. I did not walk out with anger or loud words. I left quietly, carrying only what I needed, my hands shaking not from weakness alone, but from the weight of what I was leaving behind. The door closed behind me with a finality that echoed deep inside my chest. For a moment, I stood there, unsure of where to go, terrified by the freedom I had chosen and the uncertainty that came with it. The first few days were the most frightening. I felt displaced, as though the world had shifted and I no longer knew where I belonged. I stayed in unfamiliar rooms, surrounded by silence that was different from the silence I had known before. This silence was not filled with fear or tension. It was empty, waiting to be shaped. Still at night, doubts crept in. I questioned myself relentlessly. Had I overreacted? Was I ungrateful? These thoughts haunted me because for years, I had been conditioned to believe that endurance was a mother's duty, no matter the cost. My body needed time to heal, but my mind needed even more. The pain from my injuries reminded me daily of how close I had come to something far worse. Simple tasks required effort. I moved slowly, cautiously, learning once again how to trust my surroundings. Each careful step felt like an act of defiance against the fear that had once controlled me. I was no longer walking on glass. I was walking on unfamiliar ground, and that made all the difference. There were moments of deep loneliness. I missed the idea of family, even though the reality had hurt me. I missed the sound of voices, the comfort of familiarity, the belief that I was needed. But slowly, I began to understand something important. Missing what should have been does not mean returning to what was harmful. That realization brought both sadness and clarity. As days turned into weeks, small changes began to take place within me. I started speaking more, even if only to myself. I allowed my emotions to surface instead of burying them. I acknowledged my fear without letting it rule me. Each morning, I reminded myself that I had made a choice to live with dignity, not just to survive. That reminder became my anchor. I also began to see myself differently. For years, my identity had been tied to serving others, to being useful, accommodating, quiet. Now I was learning who I was without those expectations. It was uncomfortable, but also empowering. I realized that strength does not always look like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like setting boundaries, even when it hurts. There were setbacks, of course. Some days, guilt overwhelmed me. Other days, sadness felt endless. Healing is not a straight path, especially when the wounds are emotional. But with each passing day, I felt a little more grounded, a little more certain that I had done the right thing. I did not know what the future held. I did not know if relationships could be repaired, or if forgiveness would ever come. What I did know was this. I had chosen myself for the first time in a very long time. And that choice, frightening as it was, gave me a sense of peace I had not felt in years. As time passed, the world around me continued to move forward, but I felt as though I was living in a space between what had been and what was yet to come. News reached me in fragments, short messages, second-hand updates, long silences that spoke louder than words. There were moments when guilt returned, sharp and unexpected, whispering that perhaps I should have stayed quiet, endured a little longer, protected the image of family at my own expense. Old habits die slowly, especially those shaped by a lifetime of putting others first. But each time those thoughts surfaced, I remembered the fear I had lived with, the way my body trembled in that house, the way my voice disappeared. Truth has a cost, and I was paying it through distance, loneliness, and strained relationships. Yet it also brought something I had never known before: clarity. For the first time, I could see my life without excuses clouding my vision. I no longer blamed myself for the cruelty of others, or justified behavior that diminished me. I began to understand that love does not demand silence, and respect cannot exist where fear lives. These realizations were painful because they forced me to let go of illusions I had held for decades. I grieved not just the relationship I had lost, but the future I had imagined. One where my later years would be filled with warmth, laughter, and belonging. Accepting that this future might never exist was one of the deepest losses I had ever faced. Still, something unexpected happened in that grief. I discovered a quiet strength I did not know I possessed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It showed itself in small, steady ways. In waking up without fear, in making decisions without apologizing, in allowing myself to take up space. I learned that strength is not always about fighting. It is often about choosing not to return to places that break you. I started rebuilding my sense of self, piece by piece. I found comfort in routines that were entirely my own. I allowed myself moments of joy without guilt. Slowly, I began to trust myself again, to believe that my feelings were valid and my boundaries necessary. The world felt larger now, less confined by the expectations that once controlled me. There were still unanswered questions, unresolved pain, and relationships hanging in uncertain balance. But I stopped waiting for closure from others. I realized that closure is sometimes something we give ourselves when the people who hurt us are unwilling or unable to take responsibility. The cost of truth had been high, but it had given me something invaluable: the freedom to live honestly without fear. And in that freedom, I found a peace that silence had never been able to offer. With more time passing, I began to understand that distance has a way of revealing truths that closeness often hides. Being away from my family did not erase the pain, but it changed how I saw it. From a distance, patterns became clearer. I could finally admit to myself that what happened was not a single bad moment or a misunderstanding. It was the result of long-standing disregard that I had tolerated for far too long. This realization was painful, but it was also freeing. For years, I had twisted myself into explanations that protected everyone else while slowly destroying me. Now, without constant pressure around me, those explanations fell apart. There were days when silence felt heavy again, but it was no longer threatening. It gave me space to think, to remember who I had been before fear shaped my behavior. I thought about the woman I was in my younger years, strong, capable, hopeful. Somewhere along the way, I had learned to measure my worth by how much discomfort I could endure for others. Accepting that truth was uncomfortable, yet necessary. I was not weak for staying so long. I was human. but staying silent had nearly cost me everything. Occasionally messages came through short, awkward, cautious. Some were filled with guilt, others with defensiveness. I responded politely but carefully. I had learned that reopening wounds too quickly could undo months of healing. Protecting myself no longer felt selfish, it felt responsible. I did not owe anyone access to my pain simply because we shared blood. That lesson was one of the hardest to learn, but also one of the most important. What surprised me most was how my body began to respond as my mind grew calmer. The constant tension I had lived with slowly eased. I slept better. I breathed more deeply. Even my pain felt more manageable. Fear, I realized, had been living in my body for years, quietly exhausting me. Letting go of that fear allowed healing to begin in ways I never expected. I also began to see my story differently. For a long time, I had viewed myself only as a victim, someone things happened to. Now I started to recognize my courage. Leaving had not been an escape, it had been a decision. A difficult, frightening, lonely decision, but a powerful one. I had chosen life over endurance, dignity over silence. That choice mattered. I did not know if reconciliation would ever come, or if it even should. What I knew was that I could no longer build my life around the hope that others would change. I could only build it around the truth of who I was becoming. And slowly, with patience and self-compassion, I was becoming someone who no longer disappeared to keep others comfortable. Distance had taught me that love without respect is not love, and family without safety is not home. Most importantly, it taught me that my voice still mattered, even if I was the only one listening at first. The months that followed were not filled with sudden happiness or dramatic transformation. Healing, I learned, does not arrive like a sunrise that instantly lights everything up. It comes slowly, quietly, often disguised as ordinary moments that don't seem important at first. Yet those moments were the ones that rebuilt me. Waking up without dread in my chest. Eating a meal without fear of judgment. Sitting in silence that felt peaceful instead of threatening. These small things became proof that I was finally living on my own terms, even if my heart still carried scars. There were days when grief hit me without warning. I would see a mother laughing with her children, or hear someone talk about family gatherings, and an ache would settle deep inside me. I mourned the version of my life I thought I would have in old age. The warmth, the belonging, the feeling of being cherished. Accepting that this dream might never exist was painful, but I stopped fighting that truth. I learned that grief does not mean regret. I could miss what I never truly had while still honoring the decision that saved me. Slowly, I began to rebuild a sense of purpose that did not depend on anyone else. I rediscovered simple joys that had been buried under years of stress. Reading in the afternoon light, walking at my own pace, listening to music without feeling rushed. I allowed myself to rest without guilt. For the first time in decades, my worth was not measured by how useful I was to others. It existed simply because I existed. I also learned to forgive, but not in the way people often expect. I did not forgive to excuse what happened or to reopen doors that should remain closed. I forgave to free myself from carrying anger that only weighed me down. Forgiveness, for me, became an internal process, a quiet release rather than a reconciliation. It allowed me to move forward without bitterness, without constantly replaying the past in my mind. There were moments when doubt still whispered to me late at night. Questions without answers lingered. Would things have been different if I had spoken sooner? Could I have prevented what happened? Over time, I learned to meet those questions with compassion instead of blame. I did the best I could with what I knew at the time. Survival sometimes looks like endurance until clarity finally arrives. What surprised me most was how my sense of identity began to change. I was no longer just a mother defined by sacrifice. I was a woman who had survived, who had chosen dignity over fear, who had learned that love should never require self-erasure. That realization brought a quiet pride. Not loud or boastful, but steady and grounding. I did not know what the future would bring. Some relationships remained distant, others uncertain. But I stopped waiting for validation or apologies that might never come. My peace no longer depended on being understood by everyone. It depended on being honest with myself. I had spent too many years shrinking to keep others comfortable. Now even in solitude, I felt more whole than I ever had before. As I looked ahead, I allowed myself to imagine a future shaped by choice rather than obligation. A life where my voice mattered, where my safety was non-negotiable, where love, if it came, would be gentle and respectful, or not at all. I was no longer afraid of standing alone, because I finally understood that standing alone was far better than disappearing within a crowd. This was not the ending I once imagined for my life, but it was the ending I needed. Not an ending of defeat, but one of quiet strength. I had reclaimed my life, breath by breath, step by step, and in doing so, I found something I thought I had lost forever: myself.